Hi, everybody. We're back with Robert Phoenix for our Astro-Fix, the summer of 2018. Before we bring Robert on, what we're going to do is chat just a little bit about the springtime, because a lot of people felt a lot of frustration around it, and see what Robert has to say about what manifested and some of the things that kind of softened or didn't have to come to full fruition before we launch into the summer. So without further ado, Robert, welcome.
Hey, it's great to be back with you, Regina, as always. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to see you. First of all, let's talk about the spring of 2018 and this kind of frustration. It's though a lot of people I ran into felt like they couldn't make things move forward the way they wanted to. They were feeling a bit thwarted. That was probably the most common complaint I heard just from the people around me in my own life. So let's talk about that and anything else that was really kind of prominent in your spring forecast that came to pass.
So it's a really great question, Regina, because there are three major aspects that were taking place during the springtime, which made moving forward a bit difficult. First of all, we look at Jupiter. Jupiter was retrograde. It has been retrograde for most of the spring. And Jupiter, of course, is a planet of opportunity and expansion, and sometimes just brings us more of whatever sign it's in. But when it's retrograde, especially in Scorpio, people are looking at how they use their resources, how they use their energy, also dealing with the darker parts of their nature. A lot of people like to get into this whole idea of the shadow and places inside of themselves where they're kind of hiding out, or it's dark. And so when Jupiter goes retrograde in Scorpio, in my estimation, there's much more of an emphasis on the inner life and trying to understand like what's going on, not just here and now, but looking at like our life in terms of a continuum. Where do we use our power? Where do we use our resources? And in some ways, how we even sold ourselves out with the Jupiter Scorpio retrograde. Because whenever we get into Scorpio, we talk about things like death, right? I mean, it's a sign that rules death. And associated with death is fear. Like, everything, all of our fear pretty much manifests out of the fear of death. So when we go back to that Jupiter Scorpio retrograde, we're also dealing with this kind of deeper internal process around, what keeps us from moving forward? What choices do we make out of a place of fear or compromise? And I feel like that's been going on for a lot of people. The second big aspect was the transition from Chiron in Pisces to Chiron in Aries. And this is a really, really important transit. We talked about it on the last broadcast we did. And, going from this kind of place of what I would call, and I may anger some people here, but heightened victimization with Chiron and Pisces. And that's across the board, whether you're on the left or the right, or, kind of hanging out in some kind of apolitical, atheist sort of, inner zone. There's been this really intense culture of what I would call hyper-victimization. Like the right feels that they're victimized, the left feels that they're victimized. And it really hit a crescendo when we were at those final degrees of Chiron and Pisces. Now it's in Aries, and we're all having to look at how we actually can manifest our will moving forward and take more responsibility for our lives. One of the things that you and I were talking about yesterday is your guy Zeus is now coming out with a book about masculinity and kind of new model of being a male. This is right in alignment with Chiron and Aries. And men are really going to have to, we talked about this before, realign themselves as to what it means to be a man and to be a functional male in our society. And that, in my estimation, that means blowing up sort of the old macho patterns, but also blowing up some of the other patterns where men gave their power away at the same time. So this is a really interesting dynamic. Again, this is across the board. It's not just for men, but women as well. So we're all really realigning ourselves in conjunction with our will. Go ahead.
Interestingly, Zeus is an Aries, and the book does exactly. Yeah, and the book does exactly that. It takes down both sides and looks at in a totally different new model of co-creativity. So it sounds like he's right on. And I want to make another comment about the Scorpio, Jupiter and Scorpio. We're going to be talking about talk about bringing oneself down in the darker side of nature. We're going to be talking about a couple of prominent Scorpio women a little later in this show.
Well, absolutely.
Roseanne Barr. And then my own experience has been as a Scorpio with Jupiter and Scorpio in retrograde that I've been trying to sell my beautiful, wonderful temple home, and it sold twice right out of the chute. And then, of course, it was hanging on in escrow for a month, and last minute the buyers dropped out. Another couple came and bought it. They dropped out. So it just kind of got hung up in this nowhere land the whole time, which, of course, has to do with finances. So I just wanted to say, personally, I've experienced what you're talking about right on. Let's talk about the third element of it.
Well, the third element, of course, is the big mover and shaker. I mean, literally, and that's Uranus and Taurus. So we went from those final degrees of Uranus and Aries. And Uranus and Aries was really, I think, really interesting, but also a really mixed bag in a lot of ways. I mean, you had a lot of people who were kind of waking up especially during the last 5 degrees of Uranus and Aries, like 6 degrees. So we had people that were like woke, right? There, this movie Get Out was very, very popular.
Yeah.
And that kind of triggered this sort of, kind of woke movement in the African American community, right? And then on the other side, you've got like this whole kind of, stirring up the consciousness of the feminine, like hold on a second, we're going to push back. We don't want to be, moved in a certain direction. We don't want to be violated. We want to be respected, right? And then on the same side, you've got Uranus and Aries. And again, this is like perpetuating what's going on with men and men trying to wake up, but also you've got the right waking up and the left waking. I mean, all these people were like, demanding in some ways like their own list of demands, right? This is what happened with Uranus and Aries. And then what happens, because you're dealing with Uranus, which is the ruler of Aquarius, people cluster off into groups, right? Mm-hmm. So I think one of the interesting kinds of developments, whether you're into it or not, whether you believe it or not, is the whole QAnon phenomenon. Because the QAnon phenomenon is obviously a widespread group of people who really in their own way are waking up in a way that I think is really fascinating. Now, I don't sign off on everything QAnon. I've got some major questions around QAnon and where it's all going. That's just my piece. But you cannot deny the fact that there are quote unquote middle-aged housewives from middle America who are getting into QAnon. I mean, that is really, we've never seen anything like this before. And in some ways, QAnon has even displaced Fox News in a very kind of strange meta sort of way. Now, that was all, again, Uranus and Aries, and that was individuals waking up and clustering into groups. Now that's changed. Now we have Uranus and Taurus, where, that part, whatever you came to, whatever conclusion or kind of revelation or epiphany that you had during that period of time, well, now you've got to do something with it, because that's Taurus. It's like, what are you going to do? How are you going to ground change in your life? So the springtime was this kind of really metamorphic period in a lot of ways. And I had a live stream the other night on my channel. And one of the things I talked about is this awakening process. And I really firmly believe we are in what I would call a great awakening. But it's a really critical time, when something is being born, when it's coming through the birth canal, a lot can go wrong. And there are a lot of things that can kind of, take that energy or that entity in a different direction. And I feel like that's where we are right now. And we can even look at this whole process that's taking place with Kilauea in Hawaii, right? This is Uranus and Taurus right on time. It's explosive. It's volcanic. There's new life coming up from the inside of the earth. And then what happens? It cools off and becomes this really hard material kind of, entity that we have to. So this is really a big metaphor for us. And it's not just what's happening in Kilauea, but now we've got some action down in Guatemala. The whole Uranus and Taurus thing is going to be a big story for us for the next 7 years. But that Kilauea event is really representative of where we are. We're merging from this molten existence, which is what Uranus and Aries fire was, right? And now we're coming into this cooling phase. What are you going to do with your awakening? What are you going to do with your epiphany? What are you going to do with your revelation? How are you going to make the world a better place? I think that's going to be the next chapter here that's going to be really interesting for us.
Oh, that's a fascinating place to be for all of us, because that means we can put our creative input into the situation. Let me just follow up on that really quickly. Are you saying that over the next 7 years, we're going to have a lot of kind of explosive Earth activity in general?
Absolutely.
Pardon?
Absolutely. Yes.
So that would mean all of it. Earthquakes, tidal waves,
Earthquakes, tidal waves. We have massive rains in North Carolina, just recently flooding. So it's not just limited to the, what comes out of the earth, but also, what's taking place in the biosphere. Mm-hmm. That's Uranus and Taurus, and expect the unexpected.
Okay, so thanks for the recap of the springtime. Now we're going to launch into the summer of 2018, and we're just a short distance, about 9-10 days away from the Korean summit on the 15th. So I know that you've worked up a chart for the summit. So let's talk about what you expect to see happen.
Yeah, it's a really interesting chart. And one of the things that I did is I pulled that chart for 10 a.m. roughly for Indonesian time, Singapore time. And the actual summit may start a little bit earlier, but I would assume by about 10 a.m. they'll be either on it or really rocking and rolling. So at 10 a.m. Singapore time, we have Leo on the ascendant with the true node on the ascendant in Leo as well. Well, there's going to be a lot of pomp and circumstance around this. That's the nature of Leo. Leo likes to be noticed, likes to be seen. And of course, when Donald J. Trump is a Leo rising with his ascendant at, 28 degrees Leo. So, already he's, it's being announced that he's going to be protected by Gurkhas. Right, they're going to be his personal guard in Singapore. And if you've ever seen a Gurkha, they're very colorful characters, right? They're not guys running around with Ray-Bans and little earpieces. And
what do they look like?
Oh, Gurkhas they're very. They look like they stepped out of the 19th century, right? So they're festooned, and they have this kind of semi-regalia kind of vibe associated with them. And they're going to, Gurkhas are, in terms of their complexion, they're kind of dark and exotic, right? I mean, it's like, so this is like a pageant in some ways, he's going to have Gurkhas like protecting him over in Singapore. And this is, really like in alignment with this kind of Leo rising vibe and energy. So what is Kim Jong-un going to do, right? How is he going to interact with Trump? And what kind of pageantry is he going to bring? Is he going to bring his, now famous Olympic cheerleading squad? Part of this is going to be a real spectacle. I really think they could do like a reality show out of this thing. Now, what's really fascinating is that Mars is going to be in Aquarius, okay? And that's going to be over here in the 7th house. We have Venus and Leo over here in the 1st house. So what they're trying to do now is they're trying to bring Mars and Venus into alignment, right? Opposition. And Mars is aggressive, but it's aggressive in an Aquarian kind of way. Like, can we meet some kind of Aquarian objective here? Can we set aside our Leo ego in some ways in order to come together and have this kind of peace accord? And if that's the case, then how do we do that? Well, in astrology, when we have an opposition, there's probably a pretty good chance there's going to be a T-square with another planet. And on this day, that's the case. Uranus will be at 1 degree Taurus, and it will form a T-square with Venus and Mars. So theoretically, we'd look at that position of Uranus as the point of rectification. It's in the 9th house, which is foreign governments. I think the best thing they could do, and what we might actually see happen, and this has actually been really fascinating, right? Even in the run-up to this, Putin's gotten involved, Lavrov's gotten involved, Xi's gotten involved. Even Assad has met with Kim Jong-un. I mean, who else can they bring in here, right? Kathy Lee Gifford, maybe. I don't know. I mean, so this Uranus in the 9th house is really kind of unconventional. And, one of the things that we have to kind of work out, right? And this is what I think a lot of people are struggling with at times. Like, how scripted is reality, Like, how scripted is the news? How scripted are sporting events? How scripted is the stock market? And even like something like this, how scripted is this? I mean, how much of this is for just our public consumption in some ways? Or in pursuant to that, how can there be something interesting, radical, unique, and novel that asserts itself even into the script, okay? So this is, I think, a really interesting part of the summit, and what could actually come out of it if they were open to it, right? And not fully engage whatever kind of scripted kind of play that they've got going on, is that if Putin is there, if Lavrov has been there, if Assad has actually had conversations with Kim Jong-un, if Xi from China is involved, this could actually be bigger than North Korea, right? This could be a jumping off place where all of a sudden people are sitting down and it's like, okay, well, let's see what else we can carve out here. What other kinds of things can we do that can, release some of this global tension? I think it's going to be very interesting because Uranus is the wild card. And what it's doing in this chart is it's sextiling both Mercury, well, it's kind of a wide sextile with the moon, but it's mostly sextiling Mercury, which is in Cancer. So we have a Mercury-Uranus sextile, and that's like moving the communication. And Mercury in Cancer is not, it's not like Mercury in Gemini, which is heady and wants to slice things up and dice things up. Mercury in Cancer has emotion connected to it. It's got emotional content. And by the way, the moon will also be in Cancer at that time and part of a grand trine. So we have moon, trine Neptune, trine Jupiter. That's actually a pretty tremendous trine for this event to take place. And Jupiter is going to be right around 10 o'clock in the morning in the fourth house, which is where everybody's going to be sitting down, right, in that place in the fourth house with Jupiter and Scorpio. Some interesting developments, which I've just read this morning, and this really speaks to the Trump administration in a lot of ways. Like Mike Pompeo basically slammed the door on John Bolton getting involved in the last minute with North Korea. Now, I'm not a huge Mike Pompeo fan, and I'm not a big John Bolton fan, but I think it's interesting that this is what's taken place because something's on the table here. It's been on the table for a while. What it actually is, what North Korea actually is, we still won't, I don't think we'll have a really clear kind of understanding of what North Korea actually is, because if you look at North Korea on paper, there's no way it can exist. They can't grow their own food. Mm-hmm. They got disconnected from the Soviet Union over, 13, 14 years ago. So they've been dependent on a lot of different pieces in order to just stay alive. One of the theories, again, this gets back to the scripted part of reality, is that North Korea went from being a Soviet asset to a CIA asset at some point in time. Mm-hmm. And that we've actually been involved with keeping North Korea alive as kind of a limited hang, which is what the term they use in the intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
So with the moon in the 12th house, we're still not sure, who or what North Korea is. It's hidden. It's tucked away. Can there be some resolution? I think so. But these oppositions are going to have to be reconciled. The moon is going to be opposed to Saturn at that point in time. And that's a tough opposition. The Saturn wants to be, like daddy-like, and he wants to come in and, lay down the rules and say, this is how things are going to be. And, these are the guidelines. This is what you have to give up and all that other stuff. And the moon is much more feminine and yielding in Cancer and more sensitive. So again, we're trying to figure out how they're going to bring Saturn, which is, structure, law, order, conformity, with the moon in Cancer, which is emotional sensitivity and vulnerability. And then we have the Venus-Mars opposition. So it's going to be a really interesting event. The one thing, by the way, this is totally lined up for Trump. Totally. Like when you do the synastry chart with Trump and this event, Trump's birthday is, let's see, I think it's a day before, if I'm not mistaken. So, or let me see, Trump's birthday is the day after. It is the day after this event. So he's going to have a sun-sun conjunction. Are you kidding me? He's going to, theoretically, one of the biggest events of the 21st century. He's got a sun-sun conjunction at that time. I mean, he's going to stand out. He'll shine. He'll be Trump, unapologetically Trump. He's got transit. His Mercury is on the moon, so he's going to be able to tap into the intuitive component of this. And by the way, his Pluto, his natal Pluto in Leo, is going to be right on the true note and right on the ascendant. That's really proud energy. Super proud. He's going to want to come in. He's going to want to dominate. It's going to be the Trump show. And there is a possibility that he could actually pull out of the summit with Pluto on the ascendant. If things don't go his way, he'll pull out. The one guy that you got to watch out for is Moon, right? This guy Moon, who is the current prime minister of South Korea, right? He's an Aquarius. So his sun is going to be in that 7th house. So he's going to play a very significant role. And just from kind of the, metaphoric or symbolic perspective, where's the moon? The moon is in the 12th house. And his name happens to be Moon, right? So again, that's behind the scenes. So this guy, I think, is going to be pretty influential. Here's what I think. I think if people have any kind of really spiritual impulse in their life, that they could look at this event, and whether you pray or whether you want to send good energy to it or whatever you want to do, I think it would be a really interesting exercise if people could actually throw some positive energy at this thing, so that it could like mushroom into something else, something bigger. And I think what's happened is we've all become so cynical lately with the basically the suicide ping pong that's been going on between the right and the left, and people want to out. And I think a lot of people, again, pursuant to this Jupiter Scorpio retrograde, people are pulling away.
Right.
They're kind of wanting to get out of that mix. Well, here's an opportunity where if you're really committed to your spiritual path, if you're really committed to changing the world, whether you're a Christian or whether you believe in prime creator or whatever it is, throw some good energy at this event, because it has the potential of doing something interesting. And that's from the astrological perspective with Uranus and the square to Venus and Mars. It's like, what happens if, consciousness or God or, whatever we want to term it, sneaks into that event, right? What happens? Then all of a sudden, things are going in a very interesting direction. And now we're kind of, warping off into, maybe more of a sense of global and international compatibility. It's going to be fascinating to watch regardless of how it goes down.
That sounds not just fascinating, but like a really profound opportunity. And, I look at it because I'm also jaded and cynical, I think, in terms of the players themselves, thinking they have not so far operated in a particularly conscious manner. They're more reactive than anything, emotionally reactive. And as you said, that kind of reactivity could cause Trump to pull out. If he's pumped up and it's his show and he's not liking the direction, like you say, it's possibly could pull out. But I love the idea that you're inviting everybody in to say, no, let's infuse a little higher consciousness in between all of the cells, all of the atoms of their beings, and see what kind of thing could happen, even if it's at the influence of other people around them. Who cares? I would love to see something of an unexpected magical thing happen out of that.
Yeah, I think it's, I think it's really possible to invite the quantum into that experience. One of the things that I've been playing with, just in terms of my own observations with what's going on with so-called reality, is that everybody's looking for this kind of gotcha moment. Whether it's a gotcha with this person or that person, the whole thing with Joy Reid, right? Joy Reid made some actually interesting posts a long time ago on Twitter, which I don't really want to get into. But it's like the right said, oh, Joy Reid, she's really gotten after our president. Well, look what she had on her Twitter feed, right? And of course, we have the Roseanne and the Samantha Bee and the Valerie Jarrett thing. And we're also awaiting, and this kind of gets into the QAnon material as well. You know, we're waiting for that thunderbolt to come down from heaven and strike down upon, you know, the wicked and the unjust, right? We're all waiting for that, whether it's a gotcha moment or some big piece of information. And I think ultimately, while that could be interesting to some degree, I think we're going about this in kind of the wrong direction, in the wrong energy. And one of the metaphors I use, you know, we're investing ourselves into being like these Davids, these little Davids, right? With one little shot, try to get it into the third eye of these Goliaths. And I feel like, you know, maybe what we really might want to think about is like we're Goliaths in our own way, you know, because we put these people on these pedestals, and in many ways, without their, you know, societies or their foundations or their families and their illicit wealth, they're nobody. They're nothing. You know, they're just like you and I.
Yeah.
But they have been, you know, essentially brought along with a program. And I think that's, you know, if we learned anything with Uranus and Aries where people are waking up, you know, Taurus is a leveler. It's a real lever. It's about getting horizontal with things. So let's get horizontal with the powers that be in this world. I think that's our next step.
I absolutely love it. Okay, so that's you've done a great job. Thank you so much for kind of deconstructing what this whole opportunity is for us with the summit coming up, because everybody will see this before the summit happens. So now let's take it a little bit after the summit. We're going a little later in June. I have the dates here. June 19th, we have Neptune retrograde, and then the 22nd, Venus-Mars opposition. So a little bit later in June, what do these indicate?
Yeah, the Neptune retrograde. Neptune has been in Pisces since Fukushima. I mean, it went right into Pisces right after Fukushima happened. So that's 2011. We're now in the 7th year of Neptune in Pisces, and we've got a ways to go. It's just halfway through the sign. So we're about another 7 years away before it actually goes out and moves into Aries, which will be interesting. But it's right there. It's in the second decan. The second decan is the Cancerian decan. So again, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with emotion. We're dealing with primary issues, families, children to some extent, primary water, the water you drink, the springs, the wells, the ponds, the streams. These are all really connected to the second decan of Neptune and Pisces. One of the things that you and I talked about yesterday when we were warming up for this show was I asked you the question, what is the most popular channel on cable TV? And every time I ask this question to somebody else or somebody, they get it wrong. And I understand why they get it wrong. I mean, the obvious choice would be Fox News, ESPN, CNN, right? Those would be sort of the ones that would rise to the surface. Well, I came to find out about a week ago that it's actually the Hallmark Channel. And you and I discussed that a little bit yesterday. And that gets into that second decan of Neptune, where it's in that Cancerian decan, where people want to connect with something that is emotional. It has content. In many cases, there's generally a happy ending associated with. There's also like pieces of family and relationship and continuity. I mean, it's really fascinating. This is the most watched network on cable TV.
I think that along with the Lifetime network, which is essentially giving the same kind of programming.
That's right. But Hallmark is actually on top of it. So it's like that's top dog.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why Roseanne was brought back, by the way, because the network executives pay very close attention to what people are watching and wanting. So they went back in time and they decided, well, we're going to bring back a family show from, what was that, the 80s, from the 1980s, and we're going to repopulate it and popularize it again. And they were right. I mean, Roseanne's ratings were off the hook. I mean, it was really taking network TV by storm. So they were hip to that. They said, okay, let's have our own version of this. Well, the Neptune retrograde piece, again, in that Cancerian decan, I think people are going to be doing a lot of soul searching during this time when Neptune is retrograde. And I think this is what the second big retrograde of Neptune. So this is going to be a lot of soul searching, right? They're going to be going back and they're going to be looking at, what happened to my life, what happened to my family, what happened to this whole idea of what it is to have a family and be a family. I was just watching a commercial. I'm big on commercials. I think they speak to kind of where we are in the tenor of our times. And Zillow has a new commercial. I swear to God, it almost brought tears to my eyes, okay? This is kind of what they're tapping into. So here we have a family. It's a nuclear family. How about that? That's a really interesting concept. It was a man, and then there was a woman, and then there was a son. And, the son is out. He's playing ball, and the mother is online. She sees a house. It's available on Zillow. The husband looks at it, wow, and he says, can't afford it. House still sticks around, and they decide that they're going to get this house. So you're being brought along with this commercial. Brilliant storytelling, by the way. It's such an economical amount of time. So they buy this house. You see them moving in. It's a nice old house, porch, right? Guy takes his son, and he goes to a tree that's on the side of the house. And he walks about 6 feet, sticks a shovel in the ground, and then he digs up a metal lunchbox or metal toolbox, small. And in there are baseball cards and pictures. And kind of I'm like well enough, but I think it was a time capsule he buried with his grandfather. Like that was his grandfather's house.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, wow, this is the energy that's, they're picking up on it. I mean, obviously, right? Again, they're very sharp psychographically. They know people want this connectivity. Like we are, I think our attention and our signal has been hijacked to the point where we think that Twitter is the world, right? Twitter is the world, and Fox News is the world, and InfoWars is the world, and whatever else is the world, or even CNN's, that's not the world. It's like a very shrill broadcast of a limited signal. And below that, there's a whole other reality going on. Whole other reality. And this is what the demographers are tapping into. They know that the Hallmark Channel is number one, right? So this Neptune Pisces retrograde, and this is going to be in the Cancerian decan, is getting people to think about this, to think about what's meaningful in their lives. Where is the continuity? Where is the constancy? How is this going to move forward? How do we create a culture? And how do we create a culture that's not being created for us? And we can't do that until we have the spiritual underpinnings for that. Everything else will be incomplete.
I couldn't agree more with you. That was so beautifully stated. You're getting me teared up. And, I don't even know if this is appropriate to bring up, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, because we're going to be moving into the subject of our sons and boys and children. A little later, we can just hop on it now, in that in this era, the part of the reason you're getting a little teared up and I'm getting a little teared up, and if Zeus were in the room, he would too, is that each of us have had these very challenging situations plopped into our lives with our sons, which, for me, I've always had a very, very beautiful relationship with my son, and now we're estranged at a time. That's not anything I could have ever even conceived of. And it creates kind of for me, for the furthest kind of true confessions, a little bit of a low-grade depression, because he's been such a major light in my life and part of my life. And the same thing with you, and the same thing with Zeus. And I know other women, friends of mine, who have gone through this estrangement with sons of varying ages too. what's going on? Why is this happening? And let's talk about where children come into the story astrologically as well.
Well, that's a great question, and it's a really important topic of conversation. One of the things that I tapped into a couple of weeks ago on one of my podcasts was the emotional currency of children. And whenever you look at kind of a major event, whether it's a war or a Publix protest or whatever, it's the emotional currency of children that's being exchanged for permission to fill in the blank, invade a foreign country or whatever that is. And again, we can see this across the board on the left and on the right. I went back in time and I looked at when this young woman named Naira from Kuwait was in Washington meeting for the Human Rights Commission. Tom Lantos, head of that commission, she basically sold the Iraq war. And she did it by lying. She lied over the fact that children were being taken out of their incubators,
right,
tossed in the streets. Hill and Knowlton had received $11 million to create a publicity campaign for Kuwait. And again, we see this consistently with children. And I don't want to be too cynical here because I actually think that there's something going on at a higher level with this. But when you go back and look at what happened with WikiLeaks in October of 2016, a lot of the information that came out of that was Pizzagate, right? I mean, it was the Podesta stuff. And so that was a big, big factor heading into that election. And of course, it was going to be a big factor because we're going to be dealing with the true node transiting in Leo, which is all about children. And it's still a really big issue right now. It's a very significant issue. What are we doing with our children? There's a big event you and I talked about. This starting to bubble up, this thing in Tucson, where they found this like pit where kids are being trafficked, right? And it's not hitting the mainstream news, but the alternative media is all over this thing. And then I don't want to get too deep into this, but that's actually a very real vector, right? And then you have this whole other thing going on this other spectrum, like, well, what is a child? Is a child a boy? Is a child a girl? This whole dysphoria kind of piece is coming into play. And now I just saw that, France just lowered the consent of sex to 15. Again, that's dealing with children. We have an admitted pedophile running for race in the United States. I mean, all this stuff is bubbling up because this is the one part of our psyche in our nature that I think we are the absolutely most vulnerable. It's the childhood piece. We all have trauma from our childhood. We all have it. And when we get triggered by an event, that's what's being triggered. It's the traumatic spaces from our youth, whether it's abandonment, whether it's abuse, any of these things. And so this true node in Leo it's coming down, it's in the final decan. So essentially it's coming into its own decan. It's in the Leo decan. Because unlike the planets, it's actually moving clockwise. So it starts off in at 29, 28, and it goes all the way back to 0, and then it moves into 29, 28 of the next sign, which will be Cancer. And so here we are. The true node is going to be in Leo until January, and then moves into Cancer. So when we get into Cancer, that's going to be a really interesting thing too, because we're going to be dealing with mothers, we're going to be dealing with nurturing, and this whole kind of feminine thing, and the home. It's like, well, if we have challenges with the children, we've had challenges with our kids or growing up, where did it start? It started in that Cancerian realm, right? So this is why this stuff is coming up. And as it gets like closer and closer and closer to like, it's kind of getting there now, like 3-4 degrees, it's going to start to square Uranus. So the true node is going to square Uranus. The south node in Aquarius is going to square Uranus. And then we're going to have Mars even. The Mars piece is going to be on the south node, and it's going to be retrograde in opposition with the true node in Leo. That's kind of radical. You know, that's radical. Here's what I think is going to happen. I've already seen this. Like, there is this movement around what's taking place in Tucson around this event that I was speaking of. There are like militia now of men that are like coming together to go find these perps, to go find these networks. That's a very Aquarian kind of thing, right? So this is going to be fascinating to see how all this goes down. Because in the past, when they've talked about like the militia against the government or against the state, you know, it's, you know, verboten. But what about like a militia against, you know, child traffickers and pedophiles? Now all of a sudden people are like, yeah, go get them, right?
Absolutely.
So this gets back into the men piece too. This gets back into this men piece. Go ahead.
Robert, one thing you brought up yesterday too is that there is a connection between the company Cenex and that a facility space in Tucson. And one of the owners, you said, I believe, was Carlos
Slim,
who's one of the wealthiest men in the world. I think Mexican telecommunications is how he made his original money. And so now you're looking at something that is more.
Oh, it's potentially much bigger.
Yes, potentially much bigger.
Yeah. Now, again, I can't put any, like, I can't pin any facts onto this.
Yeah.
But Kate Spade just committed suicide yesterday.
Yeah, I know. That was sad.
Well, you know, of course, the alternative community is looking into that. She's got ties to the Clinton Foundation. I'm sorry. You know, I don't want to, you know, piss off a bunch of Clinton people, but you look at what happened in Haiti and the story around Haiti, and it gets really dark and it gets, you know, very complicated and very ugly. But if you're willing to look into that, you'll see some things, you know, that may open your eyes.
The stars will start emerging. Yeah.
There's this connection here. So what's going to happen with these people that may have had some, like the NXIVM stuff? That's another whole, you know, rat's nest that's connected to both. In a weird way, the NXIVM stuff is connected to both Trump and the Clintons.
Explain, Robert, explain NXIVM to everyone.
Okay, NXIVM is, NXIVM is like a modern day Scientology. And it was started theoretically by a guy by the name of Keith Raniere. And Keith Raniere, self-styled, like boy genius, Renaissance man, can do everything. And he became very interested in spirituality and helping people, theoretically, right? So Keith Raniere was a computer programmer, and then he linked up with some very important people, one of whom, by the way, is Vicente Fox's son. So Vicente Fox, former president of Mexico, big-time participant in NXIVM. Two other big-time people involved in NXIVM were the Bronfman sisters. Sarah Bronfman, I think, what's her sister's name? Is it Emily? Sarah Bronfman was a major player in NXIVM, basically taking all this Bronfman money and investing it in all these NXIVM programs. And then the other big player happens to be Allison Mack, who was a kind of a B actress in a show called Smallville. So what happens is that NXIVM actually becomes more than this kind of like Scientology sort of, you know, hit your human potential kind of experience. NXIVM becomes involved in sex trafficking and the sex slave trade. And it gets very ugly. I mean, really ugly. And in fact, Allison Mack and Keith Raniere are like these two major handlers and programmers. And then what they would do is they would brand women. I mean, literally brand them. So there was a Keith Raniere brand, and then there's an Allison Mack brand. And then when you get into next, you begin to see all kinds of like really bizarre stuff. And bizarre connections. Like one of the connections with NXIVM is Roger Stone. Roger Stone is a lobbyist for NXIVM. He was like peddling influence on Capitol Hill for NXIVM. And if you know who Roger Stone is and what Roger Stone's about, I mean, Roger Stone likes to describe himself as a libertarian and a libertine. He's into the whole Eyes Wide Shut thing. That's his thing. And then on the other side, Nexium's got, contributions to the Clinton Foundation. And so, obviously it's a political / whatever organization. It's not political, but they want to get into politics and they want to massage both sides.
Yeah.
But when you really drill down into Nexium, what you find is again, children at the core of this, not just women who are branded. And by the way, absolutely brutalized and traumatized. And I know some of the stories, and I'm not going to share them here because they're not really all that pleasant to think about and deal with. But the whole child thing comes into play with Nexium as well. So I got one more little piece with Nexium.
Okay, and then after you're done with that piece, let's go, because we only have about 20 minutes left.
Okay, the one thing about Nexium
happening
that I have to say,
yeah,
and I've actually seen the pictures. It looks like Stormy Daniels has a Nexium brand on it.
No.
Yes.
Okay, you got to find this thing for us.
Do you really want me to find it for you?
Yeah, find it for us and we'll put it in. Oh my God.
Well, you really don't want me to find it, trust me. If it happens just below the navel, okay?
Okay, gotcha. I know what you're saying. Okay, so this kind of creepy stuff is all happening under what influence astrologically?
Well, I think it's just a true note in Leo. We're dealing with the children piece.
Yes, and you said
and again, it's like it gets back into us, right? Like our inner child, because that's how we relate to this stuff. When we see this, it's like, oh, it's not just we make this like valuation in our heads that says, well, that's terrible, that's bad, kids shouldn't have to go through that. No, it goes much deeper and hits us at a deep psychological level, and there's a part of us that identifies with whatever it is that they experience at some level in our own way.
Okay, and amidst this in our prep yesterday, you're talking about the fact this is actually a good time to start essentially rescuing the child. I mean, not just the child externally, the child within. This is a good time for protections, for revelations and understanding around children and what's been happening to them. Now is the time it's beneficial for that to happen, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, because one of the things that Leo is also associated with is this whole idea, notion, and concept of play. Like to play and to have fun and to lighten up and to be creative and, go back to a time in your life where you got a big piece of paper and a bunch of paints. You did this finger painting as a kid. You thought it was Picasso, right? I mean, that's kind of what the energy is like. And we get so embroiled in what's going on politically. We've got Saturn and Capricorn. How can we not be embroiled in it? But it's important to find things like that we love and have some interest and passion. Leo also represents hobbies. It's a hobby sign. So, I mean, again, I just speak, to my own personal experience. I'm like creating like a little garden out on my patio. Like I've got beets and stuff growing and planting. It's a hobby. It's a really good time to invest in those things. These are the things that keep us moving and grooving. This is the the spiritual lubrication for our existence, right? God loves novelty. Novelty comes through when we play and have fun and explore and learn new things. So this is a good time to do that.
That sounds good. I think all of us will buy into that one. We have only 20 minutes left because I'm going to have some really noisy workmen in the house working right over my studio. So now we have to kind of zip through the eclipses coming up, which are happening in July and August in a very short, saturated period of time. So let's hop through the implications of these various eclipses.
Right. So we have a partial solar eclipse, and that's going to happen in July, and it's going to be on the 13th, right? You just verified that. Yep, July 13th. And what's interesting about July 13th is that it's a Friday the 13th. So now we have not only the eclipse, which is partial solar, and we have this whole Friday the 13th thing, which goes all the way back to what happened in the south of France, which I really wanted to get into a long time ago. But it's going to be partial, and it's going to be in the sign of Cancer, right? So we get into that whole idea of the eclipse. It's like, it gives us, especially partial solar eclipse, it gives us the ability to deal with both light and shadow, right? Because it's partial. It's not just completely blacked out. We're dealing with a black sun. So we can look at this Cancerian kind of energy and sort of the light side of the Cancerian energy and then the shadow side of the Cancerian energy. And that, again, gets into, you know, your home, the world, kind of the world around you, growing things, local water, stuff like that. So, you know, if we're trying to derive some meaning out of this, you know, we're looking at, to some degree, what nurtures us and what doesn't nurture us. The light side and the dark side.
Mm-hmm.
Solar eclipse, partial. Now, the one thing about the moon will also be in Cancer at that time, which is how we get this whole kind of partial thing going on. And that's going to bring up this, you know, connection with mothers, with the moon in Cancer. So mothers, maternity, I would be, again, you know, you get into that very early stage of children and, you know, pre-birth and stuff like, you know, abortions, pro-life, you know, pro-choice, you know, split down the middle, shadow and light. I mean, that's part of, you know, it could be part of the dialogue. So that's, you know, that's the first eclipse that's coming at us, and that's on the 13th. The next one that we deal with after that,
I think it's the
is going to be
27th.
on the 27th.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's July 27th. And that eclipse is going to be, that's a total lunar. And so that's going to be really stretching across like Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. So if you're in that part of the world, you're going to see a total lunar eclipse. And so that's going to be on the 27th. And let me just look at the astrology very quickly for that. So there we go. We've got the sun in Leo at 3 degrees. That brings us right back into this discussion with the true node and children at that time. Okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, mark that on your calendar, right? The 27th, and just keep your eyes and ears open. The thing about the eclipses is that the energy will happen roughly about a week to a week and a half before and after. So there's about a 3-week period. So on that, you know, on that scale for that radar, children should be right at the top of the list. Okay, that'll be very potentially revelatory time for some of the stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's the period I was thinking of when we were talking yesterday in prep. And so that brings the issues to the surface. It also gives a chance for light to be shined on it and for healing to begin as well, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. So then we have August 11th. That's a partial solar eclipse. And that's going to be like really hard to see. It'll be up in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, parts of Beijing, and a little bit in Stockholm. So it's going to be really up in the upper part of the planet. And it's going to be partial. And that's August 11th. And that's going to be in Leo. And then, again, we're dealing with that Leo energy one more time, right?
Okay.
So Leo energy one more time. It's going to be, it won't hit the true node at the same way that the previous eclipse, the earlier July eclipse, will take place. But if you can put the two together, you might have like a part 1 and a part 2. You might have an intro, I wouldn't say an outro, but maybe an expansion of what takes place on that previous eclipse in July.
Okay.
It's going to be interesting for sure. Yeah.
Okay, and now we're going to, I think it's August 6th. Uranus and Taurus go stationary, and you said this.
Yeah, Uranus goes stationary on August 6th, which means it's getting ready to go retrograde. And that stationary period is generally considered kind of a tricky period. You know, theoretically, when the planet just, you know, stops in its tracks and goes this way, it's almost as if time gets stopped down, and especially when an outer planet goes stationary. And those two planets are fixed sign. Well, at the same time, we've got the sun, which is also going to be in Leo. It's going to be like kind of further ahead, what about 16 degrees, right around there, 15, 16 degrees. So I think it's 12 degrees. Anyway, but it's not going to be quite in that T-squared, but it'll play a role. So we got and then we've got Jupiter in Scorpio. So it's kind of like almost like a grand fixed cross energy right around that time. And I guess how I would, relate to it from a collective perspective and also from a personal perspective, it feels like a lot of really bottled up energy can get really explosive during that time. So we could, throw that back out into what's happening in the Ring of Fire, from a kind of a geophysical standpoint. What's happening on a collective level, are things just so bottled up that, because there's a lot of really bottled up energy right now out there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And even personally. So, the stuff, when you get into the fixed signs, they tend to be alchemical, right? They are alchemical because you're changing something that has, or you have the potential to change something that has long-standing consequences, right? Long-standing. When you get into like energy, like you can make adjustments, and it's mutable, right? It's kind of like light touch, light touch, light touch. Make the change, make the change, make the change. You may backslide a little bit with mutability. Cardinal, you're making that catalytic kind of moment, and then you're like letting it go, right? See what happens with the card. With the fixed stuff, once you do something under a fixed alignment, which is kind of what we're looking at here, that thing is going to be fixed, whatever it is. So that period, that's going to be a really interesting time where if you want to make changes to your life, be really conscious and really aware about what you're doing. Because it almost feels like timeline material, like we're forking off into other timelines. And these we have our own personal timelines, we have collective timelines, we have galactic timelines. So it feels to me like that's kind of a pivotal timeline moment for people.
Okay, and then we go just a bit after that, mid-August. This is good, right? Saturn and Uranus trine. You say this is actually a really positive time. As soon as the word Saturn comes up, people, kind of recoil. So tell us about this.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're going to be dealing with here, which we didn't really talk about, is the Mars retrograde in Aquarius. And I think this has something to do with that. Mars retrograde in Aquarius gets into this whole thing around what we were talking about earlier with Roseanne and the tweets and, to some degree, Tommy Robinson and his stuff. It's like, what can we say? How far can we push it? What happens if we push it too far? What happens if we need to push it in a certain direction? But with Aquarius, some groups don't like it. Tough shit. What happens if in some other directions where we push it too far, other groups champion it? So we're going to get into like a lot of internet rights issues with this Mars retrograde coming up. And some of it has to really do with the fact that, whether you like Trump or not, one of the things that he's done is he's basically pushed people with that Sun, Gemini, Uranus conjunction to unlock what they say and how they think, for better or worse. Okay, so, if you've been mired in a politically correct mind lock and down in that swamp, for better or worse, guess what? You get to look at it and deal with it and say, I've been a slave to my own kind of mental projections, what I'm supposed to say, think, or do. And both sides are dealing with this, right? Both sides are like getting in there and like, you want to slay this sacred cow. Yeah. And some of that is quite deleterious. But if we really step back and again have like a more adult conversation about this, it's like it really theoretically should be welcomed so that we can kind of get it out of our systems and purge this thing so we can have a really powerful dialogue about things in the world that are important, and then we don't take them personally, we don't get triggered, we're not dealing from ideology, but we're looking at it from a place of, wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about that, right? So this Mars retrograde we're going to get into a lot of that with Mars retrograde. But the Saturn trine to Uranus could be, look, I'm not a big fan, like people are saying, well, we need an internet bill of rights. I really don't think so. Like in this country, we have a thing, right? It's called the Constitution, which actually allows us some semblance of free speech. But what's really been interesting is that a lot of people, I mean, I'm sure you know this, you've been getting like, our privacy updates have changed, our privacy policies have changed. That's a big deal. That's coming out of the EU. That's EU generated. So the EU is creating its own kind of sort of best practices for the internet, right?
Right.
Well, there are some of those businesses have no social media platform. Like they're just selling you something. They're like, what are we going to do with your information?
Right.
There are other businesses that do have a social media platform, and they're basically saying what you can and cannot talk about. So with this Mars retrograde, people might, crack that open and say, well, hold on a second. I want to be able to talk about this. I want to be able to have these dialogues. And hopefully the Saturn-Uranus trine can maybe bring some of that together. It's a very brief period, right? I would look more at sort of what happens technologically during that period and what kind of things that, kind of pop into the marketplace. That'll be kind of a fascinating. The one thing that's also really interesting is, I don't know if you followed this, but again, like Trump will do something that'll just totally piss people off, right? Then over here, he signs this bill into effect that allows people to have experimental treatments, right? So if you have a kid, bring it back to a child, and they're like, in a really difficult place before, you may not be able to get an experimental treatment. And kind of now you can. And maybe the Saturn-Uranus trine might converge a little bit with that, so that maybe some of these experimental treatments actually become kind of more, less Uranian and kind of out there and more mainstream.
Right. Robert, we're about out of time. I think we covered all the major topics, but if we haven't, just a little wrap up at this point, I would appreciate.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting summer. I feel like, you and I were talking about this yesterday, and I would agree with you. You said that based on some of the stuff that you've been kind of connecting with around Gaia and other sources, that people are getting really burnt out on the conspiracy stuff, right? I mean, this is what you brought up, and I think that that's true, and I think it's time for us to begin to move kind of beyond that. Like if somebody wanted to spend a week with me, I could take them down so many rabbit holes, flip switches, and then what do you want to do after that, right?
Right.
You go through this sense of outrage, then you go through a sense of like maybe a little bit of depression, and then you get this like, okay, well, how do I do this? How do I work with this? How do I change this? Well, I think what's really going to be very important now is for us to integrate what we understand on a sort of a paradigmatic level, and then again, bring it home. We got to bring this stuff home now. It's really important. Just here in the town that I live in, they're thinking about putting fluoride back in the water. There's a group of 12 of us that met last, Monday night, town council, and it was great. Had some really credited people sitting down. We don't want this, right? This is where it's at. And if anybody really wants to get involved on a ground floor issue that affects all of us, it's 5G. Okay, you want to put some energy into something. You want to make the world a better place. Huddle with the people in your town, find out what the plans are for 5G. That's the big pushback. So that's where I think we can actually make a difference. Bring it on home this summer.
I couldn't agree more, Robert. I've been waiting for the time where we all wanted to step up into this. And like you say now, we're going to either step in it or we're going to step up and do something about it. And I so appreciate that message. It's been a great conversation. I think been very revelatory on a lot of levels for me as well as our viewers. So thank you, Robert.
It's always my pleasure, Regina. Thank you.
All right. Once again, Robert Phoenix, you can find him at robertphoenix.com. You can look to him for some of his classes, perspectives on a lot of things, a lot of large overviews, also even for private readings. So again, robertphoenix.com. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us here on reginameredith.com. Thank you for watching this video. You can find many more like it free of charge by going to reginameredith.com. And if you're finding that this kind of content is adding value to your life, you might want to support my work by clicking on the Patreon button on the website, reginameredith.com. As a patron, you have special videos, insider commentary, and much more. Check it out.